This is actually one of my favorite lectures because it makes a transition from the earth sciences to the life sciences, and sort of gives us a chance to look at where those cross over. You know, when we talk about geology, we can talk about environmental geology, which has to do with our relationship with the earth. We've talked a little bit about that. Economic geology, how we utilize the earth's resources for our own benefit. And obviously we're sort of then leading into soil science and agriculture. So we're going to focus a little bit on agriculture today as a way to look at our own sort of history as a species. We'll start with our own origin as a species, and then we'll work through how we began agriculture and how that's changed us over time to where we are today, brought us to where we are today. So there's definitely going to be a transition from a soil science kind of approach to a population, human activity kind of approach. And there's a lot of interesting things that get trapped in this kind of approach. I get to talk historically about a lot of things that have to do with the emergence of technology, how our technology has developed over the ages, and where it might be taking us. So this is another transition into a section of the course where, even though we have in the earth sciences, in geology, because we're talking planetary sciences, a lot of exciting things are happening, and new technologies are emerging that are allowing us to explore our universe and our earth in greater detail. Going forward, we're going to be talking about a lot of technologies that will actually change us genetically, change us culturally, change us in many ways, and challenge us in many ways, including ethically. So this is another way to transition into that perspective. So agriculture and human civilization. It's the last test, or the last topic for this test as well. And I begin by talking a little bit about our own origins, because it's an interesting topic in science. This is archaeology. We can use radiocarbon dating to date back the fossils that we find of our oldest ancestors, and we have done a pretty good job of going back and filling in most of those, and I quote, missing links between our evolution and the common ancestry that we share with apes. I want to make this point a few times, because the next week in particular we're going to be talking about evolution. And it's important to point out that we did not evolve from apes, and that's a misconception. We evolved from a common ancestor with apes, and we'll be much more careful about explaining just what I mean by that next week. The common ancestor that we shared about 8 million years ago branched off, and one direction went towards the modern apes, another direction went towards modern humans, through a tree of other human species that have come and gone. We are the only remaining species, but as far as we know, unless you believe in Bigfoot or something like that. Right? Maybe there's another species running around out there and we're calling them a Yeti. But that's far-fetched. Possible, not likely. But it'd be exciting if we ever found one, right? I mean, if we ever did actually find evidence of that, that would be interesting. And we did recently find some interesting evidence of other human species that existed within our historical times. The Flores man, or Homo floresiensis, which was found in the Flores Islands of Indonesia, actually was still around when early humans moved into Australia, and even early explorers started moving around the planet. They went extinct fairly recently. But most of our family tree, of course, has come and gone. We have the genus Homo, which means human. We're in a human family. We don't, there's no other animals in our family. And so we'll talk more about taxonomy too. So as we go through this, we'll look at domain, kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. So you'll see how to put that into some better perspective. Lucy, the Australopithecine that has been to our museum a couple times, and maybe you've gone to see her, was an early ancestor that branched off in a different direction. You can see the Australopithecine group here. And again, there's a common ancestor that led to them and to Homo. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about our history, about our tree here. except when we get to us, our own species, which took 2 stages to really get to what we would call modern humans. The first Cro-Magnon, Homo sapiens, appeared 100,000 years or so ago, but didn't really take on modern behaviors until about 40,000 years ago. And that's a big question of why. I mean, anatomically, we were exactly the same. There's no distinction, but somewhere we started doing art and rituals and other things that we would consider modern cultural identities. So about 30, 40,000 years ago, when we started painting on cave walls, we sort of consider that modern human history, okay, in a sense. Now, not modern in terms of we're writing it down and we have an actual history that you would study in history class, but in terms of thinking of ourselves within this evolutionary framework, we're clearly modern at that point. And we're no smarter now than we were then. We're no different, really, in any way, except that we now have a richer culture to learn from as we grow up and mature. So we have tools that weren't available then. Each of us can learn these tools and use them in our lives. And we certainly are benefiting from discoveries that have been made in the last few hundred years scientifically. But we're not really any smarter than the people that first painted on cave walls 40,000 years ago. There's also an interesting pattern of how we have moved around on the planet from where we began. So our various groups have moved out of Africa, where we originated, in various waves, including our own species, which has left Africa a couple times. And so there's some interesting discussions about our modern populations, because we do see some differences in appearance, even though they're extremely minor differences. The color of our skin and our hair and other features that, again, superficial features, enough of an accumulation of some adaptations to local environments that beg the question, how did we become who we are today? It's pretty clear that we originated in Africa. The question is, did we migrate once and spread out around the world, or did we migrate more than once and different parts of the world have remnants of that earlier migration? So in other words, we know that there were earlier migrations. There were migrations even of Homo erectus, species prior to ours. Neanderthals, of course, were already spread around when our own ancestors, Cro-Magnon, moved out and moved around. The question is, did we evolve regionally, or have we all evolved our modern conditions from the latest migration? And the evidence is that that's what's happened. That about 40,000 years ago, a migration of Homo sapiens from Africa replaced any other existing species around the globe. That all of us, we may have some Neanderthal genes, some of us have more than others, from interbreeding, but it's very minor. And it certainly does not change us as a species. And this is significant for a couple reasons. But when we look at ourselves genetically, not just our genes that go into making us who we are, but there's also genes in our mitochondria. Mitochondria are organelles in our cells that produce energy from the food we eat. They, way back when, 4 billion years ago, were independent organisms that became symbiotically united with other single-celled organisms to form eukaryotes, multicellular organisms. They had their own DNA at that time, and that remnant DNA is still there. It isn't selected for, it doesn't get, in other words, all of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother. It doesn't get recombined when the sperm and the egg come together. So any mutations that occur in the mitochondrial DNA act as a clock. It's called a mitochondrial clock, to tell us when different populations have become separate and isolated. Because if you look at the mutation rate within a population, everybody shares those same mutations. But once populations become separate, mutations start to accumulate separately. And you can trace that back in time, and you can piece this all together. And using that mitochondrial clock places all of us in Africa about 40,000 years ago. We can also trace our languages in the same way. Language does the same thing. If we all live in the same area, we share a common language, but when we separate and become separate populations, our languages begin to diverge. And we can trace that back in time. It doesn't go nearly far as back as mitochondrial records will take us, but we can see a similar thing. So this pattern of our own movement around the globe is an interesting one to look at. And something else has happened along the way that we do want to think about. Again, to get us to our modern situation, to get us to the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and when we began this scientific revolution. Everyone is aware, again, I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but the Fertile Crescent is usually identified as the Middle East area where Iraq and Iran would exist today, because this was an area that was at the time, and again, this is about 10,000 years ago, was very well suited for agriculture. Prior to this point, for the first 20, 30,000 years of our species history, we were moving around a lot. We were hunters and gatherers. We would catch, whatever food we could, but we'd also gather food, fruit and berries and vegetables and whatever we could find. And it brings up a lot of the challenges of moving away from Africa, because Africa is this nice, really idyllic place to live. So why would we migrate out? Why would we have moved around? And again, I won't speculate too much, but obviously there might have been various reasons why different peoples would have chosen to say, I'm not going to stay around here and compete with all of you. I'm going to go off on my own and try to make my own way somewhere else. But that ended up getting them into northern Europe, where it was cold and you have seasons and you can't collect food year round. You have to, again, keep food over the period of time where you can't get enough, and that's a real challenge. Well, how we overcame that challenge was agriculture, because you can grow a lot of food. You don't have to find it, you can grow it. You're proactive. And then you can keep it over winter and keep eating it instead of risking starvation. And this particular region, you can see all the rivers that flow through there. It's a somewhat flat area that, again, there's a lot of reasons for it geologically, for having a good soil. So it's got good soil, it's got rivers. It also had large animals that could be used to pull plows and do a lot of the work for us. Those three things are really important. And we'll see this as we go forward if you've read Jared Diamond's book about guns, germs, and steel, and I'll bring that up a little bit later. Those conditions are not shared around the world. Finding a location that has plenty of resources for agriculture, including large animals, gives the people who live there an advantage over people who may live in a mountainous region or a more arid region or some other place where they just don't have all those same resources. So this is sort of a beginning of our becoming separate in many ways, of us establishing groups that sort of haves and have-nots. And this is significant. Again, let me zoom in on a little bit of the history here that we can trace back in time. And as I mentioned, about 10,000, this is going back to 11,000 or so, where we see some of the first evidence of agriculture, and then that also spreads around the world. And it's now a globe, everywhere you go. People are growing food, growing crops, keeping livestock. That's part of it as well. So it's our modern way of life. It wasn't always our modern way of life, but it is now. I did like to bring up the fact that within this time frame, say 11,000 years ago to today, we have seen a lot of what we call ancient civilizations, or what we would consider even today as civilization. This is city-based, where you have a major city, a center of commerce, a marketplace, where people can bring their products, bring all of the food that they've grown, the livestock and everything else, and trade it. So we have the beginnings of currency and means of trade. So this is another major step. When we become agricultural, we also become economic. Economics become part of our equation. And so these major city-states or civilizations based on big cities have popped up all over the world. Again, there's nothing unique about any group here biologically. The uniqueness we're going to see going forward in more of a historical perspective is going to be about the quality of the environment for this purpose, for economics, for being able to grow a food and then trade it and have an active economy that can support a lot of people, and a lot of people that do different things. Not everybody's a farmer, even back then, right? You had politicians and you had shopkeepers and you had people who would manage the trade, and you would have specialists who would make the instruments that were needed and so forth, blacksmiths and on, because we're also seeing, of course, the Bronze Age, going from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And by the time we get into agriculture, obviously, we're already into that Iron Age, where we're using metal instruments to plow the fields and fight each other over resources. So each of these regions have had very advanced civilizations at different times. And this chart doesn't identify them, and it's not my specialty, but obviously there's some very interesting, the Assyrians and Babylonians, of course the Central American cultures like Mayans and Olmecs and all of the various ones, and throughout the world, we see these ancient civilizations. So you might, it's interesting to go back to that. All right, so let's bring this up into take another big step. We're sort of doing this this movement through our history in big leaps. Not a continuous movement, but we're going to leap from here to there, because we can sort of see that, see these big signposts along the way. So we've become agricultural, we've become spread out around the world, right? Those ancient civilizations have popped up all over the place. They were, in a sense, separate, however, during that time. There were isolated civilizations that were agriculture. They had emerged from the similar traditions, but had established different cultures and separate economies. Eventually, that got broken down because of, not quite to the Industrial Revolution yet, but just prior to this period, really following the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, we started moving around again and running into each other again, exploring. This is when it becomes a Eurocentric history. This is when all of a sudden most of what we think of as history, particularly American history, sort of traces its way through Europe for some reason. Because they were the imperialists. They were the economy that could afford to build the ships and to travel around and try to exploit resources around the world. They were trying to build an economy based on trade, and so they were moving out, spreading out, finding resources in other places and trying to exploit them, and along the way exploiting the people in a lot of these places as well, right? So that, however, that economy did lead to industrialization. So even though there's some amazing engineering in all these ancient civilizations, we'd never really had what we would call modern industry until the Industrial Revolution, and that did begin in Europe because of this economic structure that I'm talking about. It also brings up, and I'll get it back to this in a little bit, this idea of what made Europe so special. You want to say?
Oh, no.
Oh, I mean, it's a good question, right? And we can look at it historically. There's nothing unique about, again, Europeans in terms of intelligence or physical ability or anything else. But the way things work, they ended up with the resources concentrated in that region of the world. It is a good agricultural region. But there are also challenges there. It's not easy living in Europe. It gets cold in the winter. You have to be prepared for that. You have to have a way of having the technology available to survive the harsh winters and really the nomadic tribes. I mean, again, it's a pretty brutish society just prior to imperialism in the Dark Ages, where you've got nomadic tribes running around, attacking each other and so forth. So for defense and for agriculture and for other reasons, technology developed that went beyond just plowing fields and storing the grain. It eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is a point at which we started making things not as artisans with maybe an apprentice, not as a blacksmith with an apprentice, and if you need something from the blacksmith, you go to the blacksmith, but in a factory, right? In other words, instead of making a few horseshoes for your village, you can make horseshoes for an entire region because you're pushing them out through a factory. It's very efficient, and it actually was an explosion in economic opportunity that has now defined our modern times. We are still living within this, essentially, this time period in Earth's history where we're industrialized, and most of our trade, most of our economy is based on trade that is produced this way, through factories, manufacturing. Now we have a service economy, we have other aspects of the economy, but it all boils down to this ability to generate a lot of stuff that we can trade with other people. And it started in a place where it started being dominated by one particular region of the world, where they could produce more stuff and had more to trade and could therefore exploit other parts of the world for their resources. So again, I'm not, it's in political science here, I'm not talking about, I don't want to get too political. But I do want to point out, as another result of the Industrial Revolution, we've been faced with additional problems. For the first time, we're seeing pollution. The trees in Europe went from white bark to dark bark because they got covered up with ash. Of course, lung disease and all kinds of other things, the coal that was being burned to produce all the energy that was needed. Our use of energy has changed completely from biomass, burning wood, and so forth, into fossil fuels and other means of, our energy demands are still growing rapidly. We also established, however, a lot of practices that have allowed our populations to increase, like modern plumbing. It occurred to some people along the way. One of the things this allowed for was specialization. So it allowed for the scientific revolution because it allowed for some of these gentlemen and many women as well, but to pursue interests that didn't have to support them. You know, they had money, their estates had money. So they could be curious about chemistry and develop some of these things. Of course, it led even more to more and more of the technology that's led to where we are today. But it allowed for this comfort of living, a middle class. For the first time, there's a middle class. Instead of just having lords and peasants, you have a middle class that is able to do a job and make a living, but also have some spare time, some leisure time to enjoy some other things. Where most of us, fit today, where we're able to have hobbies and other interests and go see movies or whatever, right? That's new. That's a fairly modern thing. It's also allowed our population to increase. Modern plumbing, in particular, is probably the biggest impact on population of anything else. Before we understood disease, we didn't know why our water would occasionally just get nasty, cause disease. It just seemed like clear water, but people were getting sick. Couldn't explain that. And then a scientist figured out, there's stuff in here. There's bacteria, viruses. You can't see them without a microscope, but now that we have microscopes, we can see these organisms, and we can look at the correlation between the presence of these organisms and the sicknesses that we're seeing. These organisms are causing us to be sick. These organisms are coming from our waste. They're coming from our feces that we're dumping in the water just upstream from where we're then collecting it to drink. Let's stop doing that. Okay, let's separate our waste stream from our water sources, and boom, the population just exploded. And it's continuing to explode. This is sort of a way of looking at where it's gone from, again, and this is AD, so again, fairly modern, last couple thousand years. The population of the world has increased tremendously and is projected to continue to increase. This is actually 2020 in the last slide. This is 2000 in the bottom left. So we're about halfway, a little more than halfway between that one and that one. And you can see some pretty dramatic changes. Look at Africa and Asia in particular, but also South America and the United States. The population is growing very rapidly. About the only place on this map that it's not continuing to grow rapidly is Europe, because Europe had already gotten really full, so to speak. So these are these bring other issues. Again, cultural as well as scientific ones, environmental issues and so on, that we may want to take some time to look at. But I want to keep moving. I want to take our next big leap from the Industrial Revolution, where we start having factories. That affects agriculture too. So we had our first agricultural revolution. A man named Malthus, around the beginning of this time period, said, we're going to have some trouble if we don't do something, because our population is growing very rapidly, but our ability to grow food is not. The population grows geometrically. The amount of food we can grow grows linearly. I can't say that very well. Linearly. In other words, you have 1 acre that supports so many people. Now you have 10 times as many people. You need 10 times the acreage, right? So, that we can't do that. We can't sustain that. Going from 1 acre to 2 acres isn't enough if the population is growing exponentially. And so he said, we're going to hit our carrying capacity. Eventually we're going to have starvation, mass starvation, because we just aren't going to be able to grow enough food. Well, that didn't happen because of mechanization, because we were able to make tractors and other farm implements that did allow us to literally farm 10 times more acres. The same farmer who could, prior to this, only farm a few acres could now farm 10 times more acres by themselves, one farm. So that was a major, major advance, and it put off Malthus's predictions of problems. Now I want to keep in mind as we go through this sort of back and forth between a Chicken Little kind of perspective where, we're in trouble, things are going to fall apart, and no, we'll be fine, we're going to keep solving our problems. We're going to see this continue, and it still continues today. A lot of people have these concerns. And when I say we grow enough food today to feed all of us, that doesn't mean we do that. It means we could. If we had the economic will, the political will to distribute food equally, there wouldn't be starvation in the world. We have starvation in the world because of economics and those kinds of things. It's actually gone down. And again, we'll get back to that. We've actually, a couple stages, and we'll see, even today, there's less starvation in the world than there has been at any other time in Earth's history on a percentage of the population basis. That still means millions of people are starving. So it's still a big problem. But it's a lot of interesting perspectives that we'll be able to look at. I want to, there's been a couple things happen since this that have changed farming and changed agriculture in our modern times. I won't say in our lifetimes, because maybe the last one has happened in our lifetime. We'll get to that. But mechanization produced a new problem. All of a sudden we're farming huge amounts of land, but we haven't learned yet how to do that in a sustainable way, and it led to the Dust Bowl. So we just keep farming the same land over and over, year after year after year, and eventually the soils become depleted of resources, and they can't support any more growing, and it turns to dust, and and it's a very, coincided with the Depression, a very difficult time in U.S. history. But we learned from it. From the Dust Bowl came the Green Revolution, because the challenges that presented us with was to find new ways of doing agriculture. And so along with mechanization, we started using pesticides to control insects that were damaging crops. Irrigation, probably the most important one of these, to provide water to soils that were becoming depleted. So between fertilization and irrigation, we could keep soils from going into dust. We could also learn to rotate crops and do a lot of other things. And finally, we did something. This guy, Norman Borlaug, won the Nobel Prize for hybridizing wheat. And I'll show you a video about him in not this lab, but coming up. So it's foreshadowing. Keep his name in mind. But he was the first one to start breeding crops for specific conditions. And so he was able to breed a type of wheat that could grow in more arid conditions and keep the soil, maintain the soil. And really changed everything again. So the amount of food we were able to produce during the Green Revolution went up another order of magnitude. Just much more food from the same number of acres that we were producing food from before. Tremendously amazing revolution. It has a lot to do with what made the United States a superpower, because our breadbasket began exporting. We were growing more than we needed in this country, and we produced that for trade and so forth. But once again, it had unintended consequences. And again, there's no bad guys here, right? You can't blame the farmers, you can't blame Borlaug, you can't blame even the politicians at the time. We're trying to feed a lot of people, we're trying to make our farms more productive. What could be wrong with that? Well, all these pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers were getting into the streams and rivers and in the air and causing pollution and causing a lot of problems. DDT, for instance, one of the early pesticides, was getting into our food supply and causing birds' eggshells to be too thin, and so the bird populations crashed. We had water quality issues where a lot of people were getting sick because there were pollutants in the water. Too much nutrients in the water from fertilizer was leading to eutrophication, and so fish were dying all over the place. I mean, it was really bad. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was sort of a seminal book in this recognition of this, where she wrote about these issues and said, you know, we need to change some of the ways we're doing things because we're doing as much damage as we are doing good. And so we started, that's the beginning of the environmental movement. For the first time we realized, we can't just do whatever we want. We have to think ahead a little bit more. We have to think about what's going to be the impact of what we do. It's an interesting perspective. I always bring this up about, and again, because I want to make sure you understand, this is not about, those silly people back then who didn't understand, and now we do. It's not about us being smarter than they were. It's not about our culture being more advanced either. It's just about how we as a culture, as a species, continue to progress. And we're going to see this continue. Things we're doing today, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to look back at and say, why did we ever do that? We just haven't figured it out yet, what we're doing wrong. And that's going to continue. We've gone from a period of time in the United States in the 50s where we just thought we were going to conquer the world, right? The Green Revolution, we were feeding everybody all this, we were damming rivers and producing energy through hydroelectric power. We had pulled ourselves out of the Depression through these works projects. I mean, we were just conquering the world. We were engineering our environments so that we could have ports all along the Mississippi River, not just New Orleans and Baton Rouge, but St. Louis and Memphis and on, all of these advances of technology that were allowing us to control our environments. That was the ethic of the time. There's a science fiction writer named Isaac Asimov who wrote a series of books in the 50s, included the Foundation trilogy, and that there was sort of a utopian kind of future in which the entire Earth had been covered by a city. There was no more natural spaces, but it was perfect because we had completely engineered everything to be perfect for us. The air was clean, there was no pollution, there was no disease, because there were no disease organisms anymore. Everything was great. Well, as Silent Spring came out and we continued to learn that that's really not sustainable, that we really couldn't do that. We couldn't survive that way because we need the environment. We need the environment to keep the air clean. Yes, there are disease organisms, but many of the other organisms in the soils are keeping the air and water clean, keeping us from getting sick. Your own microbiota. You have more bacteria in your body than you have your own cells. And if you were to get rid of all that bacteria, you wouldn't survive. We have to have those bacteria in our bodies to make us healthy. We'll talk a lot more about that one too coming up, because I think that's we're at the cusp of an interesting change in our perspective on how we think about bacteria. But even Asimov started realizing, this is true. And so he had gotten to like book 20 of his series now, this Foundation series. And in book 20, he had an Earth that had been destroyed by all of the practices of pollution and everything else. We'd all left and gone to some other place. But the Earth had become a living thing, a living entity. And this is based on a hypothesis that a scientist named James Lovelock had called the Gaia hypothesis, was to think about the Earth as a living thing because it sort of breathes. Volcanic eruptions put CO2 in the air, subduction buries carbon and other things. There's that huge cycle over long periods of time that keeps the atmosphere stable, that keeps everything going. And there's feedbacks. When you push on the Earth, it pushes back. And so his suggestion was, we should think about the Earth this way. Just as we think about ourselves, maintaining our health requires having the right input of materials that we can then use to be healthy, balanced with what we put out to the environment, and keep it all sustainable. And so Asimov took that idea a step further and actually made the planet somewhat of like a living thing. So it sort of enters a complete shift in our perspective in about 20, 30 years in the career of that one writer. We had shifted our mindset completely. Now this is my era. This is when I grew up. I was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, when this environmental movement was really taking off. We've gone through some back and forth, over the years where, we have to argue, we have to decide, and this is, again, when I always throw it back on you. What is sustainable? We have to sustain an economy, and we have to sustain our resources, our environment. Where do we find the right balance with that? When should we protect the ecosystem, for instance, when people are going to lose their jobs? What's more important? Should we make sure our air and water are pristine, even though that may make products very expensive, and again, people are going to lose their jobs? I mean, where are our lines here that we can draw? Because they're not always very clear. And that's where we are today. We have to make decisions. Are we willing to pay taxes to do this for a green economy? Are we willing to give up on some things that we have enjoyed because we understand now that it's not really sustainable? What are we each individually willing to do? What are we willing to do as a culture? And there's going to be different opinions all across the spectrum, and we all have to be able to have that discussion. That all started with Rachel Carson and continues today. It also has brought us to the latest agricultural revolution, which all of us have been living through in the last couple decades, and that is agribusiness. Agriculture has become less about family farming and more about being a big business. We now have genetically modified foods. Almost all of the seed that is used to grow any of the crops in the United States is genetically modified and have patents. The courts have decided that a company can patent these genetically modified organisms, and that gives them control over their sale and the profits from that. That's a big decision, a really big decision, because that means now companies like Monsanto can tell farmers, no, you have to use our seed because it's the best seed out there and we're the only ones who have it. We have a patent on this seed. And so it's led to some issues. Genetically modified foods themselves bring up a lot of different issues. People across the spectrum disagree about whether they're healthy or whether it's a good idea, whether they're dangerous. And we'll talk more about that in lab next week. Next week's lab is going to really take off from this and go further into nutrition and some of these issues. We also have organic farming. It's interesting how we've got, in response in many ways to this agribusiness, has been the organic farming movement, trying to get back to those kinds of practices that many people believe are best practices. Think about, and I'll just bring this up as an example because it can bring up a lot of issues that are both scientific and emotional and so forth. And as eggs, how many people buy free-range eggs instead of just any egg? Does anybody make that choice? Or cage-free? What's the difference between cage-free and free-roaming?
The chickens aren't held in a cage like 24/7.
Right.
They're let out to eat the insects whenever they want to.
Well, this is where it gets tricky, okay? And this is what we'll develop more in next week's lab, because all these companies have lawyers and people who are arguing over this language. Cage-free means they're not in a cage. They could still be in a pen. They could still be packed in so tightly that they can't move around individually. That's what free roaming means. Free roaming means they can actually walk around. So you'll see a lot of cartons of eggs that say cage-free. They think, oh, good. Those chickens are free to roam around. No, they're just not in a cage. They're in a pen. So you have to watch these kinds of things. So if you look for free roaming, and these are regulated. I mean, there's a distinct legal definition to those terms that companies are allowed to put those terms on their products. And this is true of a lot of things, not just the chickens. I just bring this up because it's an easy example, right? We've all seen those cartons. What's that?
Which one is the best egg, the cage one or the free?
Well, no, see, that's the other part of this issue. And this is where this thing is always interesting to me. Why did we go to agribusiness? Why did we get there in the first place if it's so bad? Well, because it produces a lot of food for a growing population at an affordable price. It keeps it affordable. If we were to go back to all the older practices, the cost would go up, right? Usually organic costs more. There's a reason for that. It takes more work to produce the organic products because you need more space and you need more more attention because you're not keeping the insects out with pesticides or the herbs with herbicides or whatever. The other thing about agribusiness is they've started to, one of the reasons they don't let the chickens move around freely, has nothing to do with the eggs, but it makes their meat more tasty. They may not be able to walk around, you can watch the videos of the turkeys especially that aren't able to walk on their own, literally. I mean, they just lose the strength in their legs to walk, but they produce more white meat, which is what people demand. The use of steroids and other antibiotics to keep them healthy and so forth can produce a better meat by many standards. If you look at the marbling, you look at the ratio of fat to protein, all these kinds of things can be controlled and manipulated to get a better steak. But it's somewhat artificial. So those are your two perspectives. Well, is it better or is it artificial? Is a genetically modified organism better because it's sweeter? When you genetically modify organisms for many different reasons, it might be to make sure it might be to make them more insect resistant. So you don't have to put a pesticide on the field because the product itself will resist the insects because you've modified it to do so. Or it may not die in a freeze. A peach, for instance, a peach crop used to just be lost completely almost when it would freeze early. Well, they've genetically modified them to survive colder temperatures, and so now peaches are more abundant, or something like that. And they can be bigger, and they can be sweeter, and they can have all these different qualities that would have been considered by themselves a much better product. What's the cost, though? I mean, and that's the other side. So there are people on either side of this, and I'm not trying to take a side, because it's not a simple argument. It's not a simple this or that argument. You can watch a lot of these documentaries like Food Inc. for yourself, come up with your own decisions and so forth. But again, keep your healthy skepticism in mind, and because this is another issue like climate change or something else. It's very propagandized on both sides. So you have to wade through a lot of that. And you have to sort of try to decide, what's going on here. And again, it's interesting how political this has become. Whether you should have chocolate milk in schools, for instance, in school lunch programs, because chocolate milk has so much added sugar. Is it not healthy? And some people say, that's just silly. Where are we going as a society when we can't have chocolate milk in our schools? But let's think about it. Let's have that discussion. That's up to you, all of us have to have these discussions. I bring this up just to sort of point to some of the percentages we're talking about. Again, 80% of the packaged foods in the U.S. are now genetically modified. About 90% of the canola oil, and you can buy canola oil at the grocery store. 86% of corn, 93% of cotton, 93% of soy. That's the percentage of those products that have been genetically modified. Now again, is that bad or is that good? Or are there, within that percentage, some good and some bad? I mean, this is one of those under-the-radar kinds of things that most people aren't really thinking a lot about. Yes?
How do they genetically modify the crops, though?
Well, it started with just crossbreeding. I mean, that's sort of the beginning of all this. And that's kind of genetic modification, but it's usually considered okay. I mean, that's how we get dogs, right? You just crossbreed things. Take a wolf, you crossbreed it for certain characteristics, so now you have a tame dog. We do the same thing with crops. So we want a crop that gives a better yield. We crossbreed different things. And this is one of the concerns we're coming up with, is that as the more we genetically modify them and patent seeds, the less ability we have to bring in wild genes to keep the crops healthy. And so they're more likely to collapse. But modern techniques can literally put a gene in, right? So in the embryo of the plant, which is the seed, you can go in and put a gene in there that may have come from another plant or a bacteria or whatever. You want it to be able to resist a certain type of virus, for instance. Well, here's an organism that is resistant to that virus. Take that gene, put it in the plant, now the plant's resistant. You want it to be bigger, right? You take a gene from a plant that makes a bigger fruit, but that fruit isn't very good, doesn't taste very good, so you take the gene that makes it bigger and put it into a fruit that does taste really good, and now you get a bigger watermelon, or you get a bigger strawberry that's still sweet. Or you can take a sweet gene and put it in there, right? And we've been able to identify all these genes. We can map the entire genome of many of the plants that we consider crops. And so we can say this gene does that, this gene does this gene does whatever else. Take it from here, put it in here, now we've got a product that's better. That's what we do. That's what we're doing. So when we say genetically modified, those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. They're genetically modified to produce either a greater yield or to be more resistant to pesticides. And again, that means we use less pesticides. So that's a good thing, right? What does that do though to the product itself? If it's, does that put a chemical in the product that's somewhat unhealthy? So that's people's concerns. People's concerns with genetically modified foods are that we don't know yet whether there are any health impacts that go along with some of these genetic modifications. And so you'll see propaganda on both sides. You'll see all kinds of claims and different things, and there's usually truth and lies in all of those things. Any propaganda has to be based on some truth and then stretch it way out of whack. So you got to be able to sort of wade through a lot of that stuff. And so the last thing I want to do before the quiz here is just talk a little bit again about a bigger context, again, more of a complete environmental context than just agriculture, but oil and gas and synthetic products. We're in lab next week. Again, we'll not only talk about nutrition, but we'll look at hydrocarbons and the synthetics that we make from that, the polymers that we make from that. Most of the clothes in the room are actually synthetic. They're not naturally cotton-based. Some of our clothes are probably cotton, but most of them are polyester blends or something else that came from oil and gas, along with the materials in your shoes or what. I mean, it's just, again, the statistics are about 80% of the products in this room come from oil and gas, not otherwise natural products. So how sustainable is all this? How important are economic considerations against environmental considerations? How sustainable is this going forward that we're doing all these things? And so these are the kinds of questions we want to start asking, and individually as well as a group, we need to ask these questions going forward. Okay, this is where I'm going to stop this lecture, but I'm going to come back to this in lab next week. So this is where we'll pick up in lab. So this one presentation in Blackboard will do this lecture plus next week's lab. But at this point, we can go to the quiz for today. All right, a lot of interesting stuff, of course, in the book that I don't have a chance to talk about. So, keep reading, and the quiz is after all the nutrition stuff. We'll get there. All right. So, pesticides are one factor that enabled the Green Revolution. That's true. Irrigation, fertilization, pesticides, herbicides, all of these things, along with new technologies in terms of mechanical instrument. I remember I grew up in a more rural area. I had a friend who owned a farm, and it was great spending the night on his farm. It really was. And I remember where they bought a new tractor. I mean, it was amazing. It was $100,000, and this was in, 70 something. That's a pretty expensive tractor. And I remember the father was so excited to get his new tractor because it could do so many things that he couldn't do before. Now he could farm more acres and so forth. So there's always been that, but the Green Revolution really has brought in these other factors that we're now also having to deal with. So true, pesticides were. Number two, Robert Malthus predicted widespread starvation due to population growth during the Industrial Revolution. True, he was the first one to he was an economist. Wasn't a scientist, he was an economist, but he was the first one to sort of recognize, we've started along this path now of we have to question our sustainability. Can we sustain ourselves as our population continues to explode? And it's still exploding, hasn't slowed down. Can we keep feeding everybody? Can we keep these problems at bay and keep solving our problems, or are they eventually going to catch up with us? So he was the first one to sort of sound that alarm. So far, we've been able to keep ahead of these things. And we'll discuss this a little bit more next week, whether we can continue to do that. But yes. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, 1962. True. I'm not going to trick you with something like, no, actually it was 1963. I don't tend to do things like that. So, just FYI. But if I'd said, Kit Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, that wouldn't be right. I do want you to know Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson's an important person to remember because she started this whole new movement that we're currently living in. All right. Greater than 89% of soybeans in the U.S. are genetically modified. That's true. We just saw 93% on the graph that I put up. It may be more than that now. All right. This statistic, 89, was when I first put this quiz together about 10 years ago. Now 93. That graphic I think was 2010. So it's as recent as I could get, but who knows where that is now. So that's true. It is greater than that. The Dust Bowl occurred in the 50s. That's false. It was earlier than that. So, again, not a specific date, but a decade. That's okay. I can do that. All right. So we're finished. All right. True. 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 Oh man, it did this to me again. False. I clicked the wrong thing. All right. See, I'm not doing real well on these quizzes. That's twice now I've clicked the wrong button. Yes.